I'm worried if there is not a bigger crack in Israel amongst the support. I mean, actually, Netanyahu's not popular, but he's exercising power. And if there isn't a crack there, a crack in Turkey, a crack in Egypt, um, or Jordan, or Iran or Yemen does something spectacular, then I think there's a real danger at this point.
So Max, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about uh, maybe you could tie in your agricultural work into this because it's all interrelated. But I just get the sense talking to people that there's this widespread pessimism for good reason. Don't get me wrong, but uh, a sense of pessimism about the future in the face of the ecological crisis that I think is partly rooted in an unawareness of the fact that we have, plans for what we could do to extricate ourselves from this crisis. But the problem is that these plans are just not widely disseminated. They're not widely known. You have, people will know the phrase the Green New Deal, but if you actually ask somebody what is that, you're not going to get very much because people don't know very much about it. And I think if people understood that we have the ability to solve the ecological crisis and avoid all of the future suffering that would be baked into the cake if we let it turn from crisis to catastrophe, that might, provide a little bit of ballast or maybe even inspiration to people. So could you just discuss a little bit? I know you've written about an idea for a Green New Deal in Africa. Could you give people a sense of, in broad terms, what that would look like?
Sure. So it's probably underappreciated that the problems linked to mostly resolving the ecological crisis, which encompasses not just the climate crisis, but also biodiversity crisis, soil erosion, uh, are technically solvable. They're technically solvable more or less at the industrial level. They're technically solvable at the ecological level. They're technically solvable at the energy use level, at the building sector level, at the infrastructural planning level. People don't understand fully that the problem is categorically political, including of course, the political willingness to accept some kind of changes for our generation in terms of our lives. That is, there's certain things that cannot be adequately replaced in the short term that basically that would require a trade-off that would say that you would not, your generation is really not going to have a great access to these things that older people didn't have access to anyway. And those technological problems will be resolved down the road. So this is just my general prefatory comment. Now, if you look at something like the agricultural and land use sector, which is something between 23 and 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. Keeping in mind that these numbers are always depend on what is included and excluded. You can resolve all of that and get it to zero. You can get it negative, in fact. Um, Agriculture on its own terms is historically within human civilization mechanisms, technologies for gathering essentially solar energy and converting it into a form that's usable by humans, that human ingestible energy calories, right? And this is what agriculture is. Now, people like Marxist biologists and energy systems progressive-minded energy system experts like David Pimentel and um, Levins, Lewontin, Yvette Perfecto, and so forth, who are very important to read, have basically argued, and it was put forth in a famous report called the Vandermeer Report, which was actually published 16 years ago now, that agriculture had shifted from a process of using the sun to grow peanuts into a process of turning oil into peanut butter, right? That agriculture had basically, modern industrialized agriculture had essentially turned the ecological logic of concentrating low density energy into high density energy via the input of human labor itself and human knowledge, even more importantly, into this kind of entropic activity that then produces massive human produced um, uh, anthropogenic global warming, anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So this is one example. And so we have all sorts of forms of land use planning, agroecology, reforestation, that is foresting areas that were not previously that lost their forests, which is very different from afforestation, which means putting new forests. Land management through the restoration um, of community control over forests, community control over pasturing land, including the incorporation of sustainable pasturing technologies and sustainable forest management techniques and so forth, including sustainable management of wood harvesting, of course. That in the agriculture sector, in the first place, you can get to zero, and also you would get negative because the process of doing agriculture in the first place in these sustainable ways, which I advocate much more for the first world. The third world has some maneuvering room there. The process of doing agriculture in this way increases the carbon count in the soil organic matter, which contains carbon, and it will also allow for both the preservation and also the reforestation. I mean, the maintenance of forests would allow for the maintenance of mangroves, for example, would allow for more carbon dioxide to be stored within these herbaceous matter in the form of carbon itself, right? So you can get negative if the negative is a couple percent, or if it's as high as 10% of current human produced greenhouse gas emissions. We don't really know, but it can be done, right? And these are actually relatively rapid forms of ecological and land management and agricultural transition that you can initiate immediately if you did appropriate extension, and you could have it worldwide in 10 years with the right political arrangements, more or less, right? You need a couple, the land is going to be very bad for a couple years because it's been the biotic life in it has been destroyed by chemical farming, but you can carry out widespread transitions. And also the losses in terms of productivity per hectare in the first world are usually on the order of 20 or 25% using current species, subspecies of crops, especially cereal crops. But that's, again, this is just using existing technologies. That is, there hasn't been a process of participatory plant breeding of sorghum, barley, wheat breeding, never mind tree crop breeding, that would actually seek to do sustainable permanently, more or less permanently, sustainable forms of a crop cultivation that are also carbon negative. So again, there's a bit of speculation involved, but the amount of calories that are produced is already currently in excess of the amount of calories that human society needs on a worldwide scale. So we can take the hit. A lot of it is fed to animals, although like cereals are often fed to animals in ways that are gratuitous. And a lot of it is also used for biofuel plantations and so forth, also gratuitous. So the amount of calories produced is not a problem. You're not going to face any form of starvation through a shift to fully sustainable agriculture. we can discuss exceptions and bottlenecks and so forth. So there you have that. Then you have the building sector, right? Which again is maybe 10, 15, 20%. It depends so much on how you measure it. The building sector can go carbon neutral, carbon negative. People point out that steel and concrete are extremely hard to be transform into carbon negativity. It's very true, and I listed a lot of examples that you can find many more. There's a lot of zero carbon, essentially zero carbon, or even some people claim negative carbon dioxide building techniques, for example, using wood, using this kind of wood shaped into massive blocks that have a strength that's very much equivalent to concrete or even reinforced concrete. And you can actually build medium rises with wood, right? And you can also build smart. You can build in such ways that you really don't need much air conditioning or cooling or heating. This can be done. You can do it with passive technologies, through shading windows, through using a lot less glass and so forth. So again, you can deal with this sector. The transportation sector, again, can be massively reduced through shifts to public transportation and shifts to bicycles, shifts to kind of encourage reduce movement in urban centers by relocating work so that people don't have to travel as far, so that people's lives actually become better. And so I picked up a lot of this from classical literature around like Paul Goodman or Ivan Illich, Louis Mumford, who were by no means revolutionary Marxists, but had a lot of insights on sustainable and convivial planning. And this stuff was actually picked up by a lot of the third world Marxist planning currents that I work on as well, like Salahuddin al-Amami and Duidar, Fawzi Mansour, Ismail Sabri Abdullah, who I wrote about recently as well. So again, you have a variety of transformation possibilities, and I canvassed a lot of them in my book, and it's quite excessively footnoted even, and there's been a lot more that's come out in the recent period. And of course, there's certain things that cannot be it's very hard to decarbonify steel production, although it is possible on small scales. But of course, we need steel for a complicated and modern human civilization. Anyone who says otherwise is just running their mouth and talking shit. I mean, it's not a serious proposition to have a steelless human civilization. So there's ways to both produce it, and there's also ways to use clean energy in its production, and there's also ways to balance out the carbon dioxide that's produced in some of the steel production by again using carbon in negative building techniques or agricultural techniques in other sectors. You can get to an actual net zero, not net zero the way, the Gates Foundation talks about net zero. What they're talking about is actually blanketing Africa and Asia in biofuel plantations. And also, eventually, they're going to try and roll out carbon scrubbing technologies and probably sun blockers, right? That's what they mean by net zero. Net zero in a kind of arithmetic planning sense that you can achieve it. And also, people like Jason Hickel have done a lot of modeling exercises showing that you can have a good life within a kind of within ecological limits. Ecological limits is something we can discuss more. It's a bit of a problematic phrase in some ways, but nevertheless, it's clear that based on both modeling exercises, existing technologies, and also the imagined technologies that we would have if we actually devoted our country's R&D technologies to building up sustainable forms of technology. That is, if we used human ingenuity in ways that was not being dictated by the monopoly private control of the productive forces, in other words, capitalism, then we would have a very different suite of technologies to look forward to, right? So all of this makes it clear that the problems of planning, of sustainable planning, of more or less permanently sustainable planning are entirely political. Now, the thing I like to add when I say that, though, is that when I say it's political, I don't mean, of course, that that we can get things going immediately because building up political power is very hard, right? And building up adequate political power uh, is extremely hard and takes years. But insofar as people are paralyzed or worried or apprehensive or fearful of kind of onrushing apocalypse that's linked to the technical impossibility of dealing with these problems, I think people should disabuse themselves of that idea and begin to learn about some of the literature and they should definitely like Google some of the names I was looking up and follow the footnotes and things that I've written. So everyone can understand that our problems are people getting organized and states taking action. Our problems are really not the impossibility of worldwide just transition and a decent life for people. Like those are not technical or technological problems. They're political and social problems.
Yeah. And another thing is you get I pick up the sense from a lot of people around me when I was back in the US, same there, that the just transition would involve a great deal of pain or lack of pleasure. Things that we enjoy would be less. And I think it comes from the kind of the centrist, liberal, sort of very individualistic kind of solution
consumerist
consumerist
thinking.
solutions in quotes where it's like use paper not paper bags cloth bags and paper straws or whatever and turn off your lights and all of these stupid little minor things that will never have the impact that we need to actually achieve a just transition. And so people think of the transition in terms of penury and it's like I have to put on a hair shirt and flagellate myself and whatnot. And the exact opposite, it seems to me, is the truth. I mean, just to start from your starting point, agriculture. A friend of mine, Francesco, talks about the political economy of taste. And he's saying, it's so much more pleasurable to have food that is locally produced, uh, organically grown, small scale production, etc. Just the taste is better. If you eat a tomato that was grown, down the street versus a tomato that you get in a supermarket that's been shipped 1,000 miles from somewhere else, the difference in taste is massive. So you've got the pleasure of eating, of enjoying meals with people would be increased in a just transition world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg because other things you mentioned, from smaller commutes, more livable cities, convivial city planning, all of these things.
Health.
Health, yeah, yeah, exactly. So I don't know if I really was able to form a question out of this. I just wanted to throw that out there, and perhaps you could just describe a little bit more specific to the African continent. There you have less of the path dependence. You have more of a capacity to leapfrog the fossil fuel based development of the U.S. or Europe. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you think that leaving aside the potential for leapfrogging, other problems way larger in your mind, or are you more optimistic about a kind of just transition in the global South?
mean, I'm more. I don't know if I'm more optimistic. I try to remain optimistic about both of them, and I think both hemispheres, speaking figuratively, have the same challenges of mustering the political will and the social organization. Take Tunisia very concretely. I mean, people of all classes are spending a huge portion of the day either driving around, stuck in traffic. That's if they're middle class or above and have their own cars. They're stuck in traffic and they're driving around, often very far because it's a very dense and sprawling city. Or if they're a bit lower middle class, waiting for a taxi, which could be hours and hours to wait for a taxi, or using a very poorly maintained public transportation system, which the state doesn't have the fiscal receipts to invest in adequately, right? So, there's some quip that how do you know a country's in the first world? The wealthy take public transportation, right? And it's very much true in the sense that, you can have an effective public transportation system that basically increases the quality of life for the overwhelming majority of the population. That's one thing. And so this is, and so even Americans, most Americans are not used to having a quality public transportation system. In fact, especially an interstate rail system. I mean, most Americans kind of like this idea and just cannot believe that it's not implemented on the European model. Actually, the European model has a lot of problems as well because of the underfunding and the conversion of high-speed routes into luxury items. But and they're actually slowly restoring some of the lower speed overnight trains, to take an example. Right. I mean, you don't need to be going fast if you're sleeping overnight on the train, to take another example. Right. So what is speed? What is doing things quick, and how does that relate to quality of life? Are these qualitative questions that are not really explored in too much of the discussion. I mean, if you take the question of food, for example, what people are saying about tomatoes and fruits and vegetables is actually related to the denudation of the organic matter and the nutrient content of the soil itself. That is because soil is turned into this kind of inert substance that's not very different from like rubber. It's actually used as an inert substance within which water and pesticides and herbicides are all applied and replace the soil itself. And actually, it's true that not only does it taste different, but the nutritional value itself of a lot of foods, including Green Revolution cereals, that is the modern cereals that everyone in the North is eating, basically, they have a much lower nutritional value. They have less minerals, they have less vitamins, they have a lower protein count than these older types of slightly less productive cereals that nevertheless are much better and taste better and would actually produce, in that sense, a qualitatively better life. And so there's this kind of, and I would say it invades the left, but in fact, the left is fully responsible for it. This kind of idea that takes current consumption patterns as kind of expressing the sovereign free will of the northern, let alone the southern consumer. Actually, you see a lot of convergences north and south, especially in terms of consumption, especially in a country in North Africa, for example. And this is very ridiculous that it's even allowed to be spread in the first place, because it actually has no connection to reality. It's a very neoliberal dogma of kind of consumer sovereignty, not understanding the fact that the entire gamut of consumer products that people are daily consuming, that the computers we consume, but also the phones we consume, and also the food we consume, and also the cars we consume, almost everything is actually a reflection of what has been deemed profitable through the path-dependent ways by private monopoly capital, right? And they haven't been put under a sovereign system of popular planning and control as to what people would actually like, which is why you hear these things about the tech trillionaires don't allow their children to use cell phones. They allow everyone else to become addicted to them. To take another example, right? These very important sovereign objects that are supposedly the kind of embodied crystallization of modernity and freedom are themselves, denied from the tech overlords to their children. So, and if you look, of course, to speak more specifically about patterns of consumption and production in a country, a lot of the countries of Africa. I mean, this was also already being critiqued in the late 1950s and early 1960s that the specific patterns of production and consumption were producing a specific type of class society that would actually have mimetic consumption patterns that would be imposed upon them by the North, but that would be culturally reproduced through patterns of identification and aspiration, and that would kind of weave the entire Southern production and consumption market circuits into a monopoly capital, northern monopoly capital and its technological patents. And of course, that's been obviously these are ecologically corrosive. And of course, these have also been deepening over the recent period with like the spread of supermarkets and also highly processed goods into ever further corners of Southern diets. And these are bad for people. They lead to value drain. The control of the companies is generally in the North. They destroy farmers' livelihoods. They reduce the size of internal markets, actually, thereby preventing sovereign popular economic planning and production. And they circularly reinforce this kind of compression of wages by being priced in such a way that they are cheap calories, widely available to working class people, that allow for a wage compression that then creates a kind of export-oriented industrial pattern, but also export-oriented agricultural patterns, at least for a certain swath of production that is both ecologically, again, corrosive, but is also providing these types of imported semi-luxury goods that then stabilize northern middle and upper classes in a kind of consumer investment in capitalist production and consumption. So all of it can be, this is where Samir Amin, but he was very much kind of actually following in the train of the Chinese Revolution, and he was kind of saying the same things as Clive Thomas and Walter Rodney and others, and Mohammed Ouidar at this time, and also echoing what was happening in Tanzania, and there was plans being purveyed in Lagos and elsewhere. That this is why a more auto-centered economy might have some short-run sacrifice, but in the long term would lead to much better lives. And it applies in spades to the ecological level. I mean, there's not a reason to be importing a lot of things that are actually expensive and also gratuitous, and that analogs of them could be produced locally. Like, for example, why in a country with a huge amount of wool is there such an import of polyester and so forth, fabrics, including rugs, for example, right? For one thing, a lot of the wool products are overproduced in this bizarre way, even though they're more or less sustainable or could be made sustainable. They're kind of overproduced by underpaid craftspeople who cannot saturate the domestic market because the domestic market, one, doesn't have enough buying power, and two, doesn't has been conditioned away from actually valuing these products, right? Whereas so wool production and livestock and so forth can be more or less made carbon neutral, right? Within reason. There's debates about that. Yet, aesthetically, of course, this is a subjective thing, but I think, a lot of people can be convinced at least that these are superior grade products and would have qualitatively better lives, but through this kind of intertwining process that I've been discussing, have been pushed away from this idea that it's plausible to have this type of qualitatively different life. And this applies to all lots and lots and lots of goods that are maybe relatively more labor intensive, but that also last longer and are higher quality. And this is also why something that Amin and Douidar and Sabri Abdallah, but also very modern stuff about, Aaron Vestingen and wrote this book about degrowth. And so something that comes up a lot, and including this is a point where I appreciate what a lot of the degrowth work out of the Iberian Peninsula and elsewhere, and even the decolonial multi-verse work, which otherwise has a lot of issues. It talks about repair workshops, right? And actually repairing. again, this is rather than having a political economy of ecologically destructive planned obsolescence, you plan long term. You plan for sustainability, including incorporating technology into your long-term planning horizons. And this actually allows for you to have qualitatively, just better lives for people, whether in all the various things that we consume that are part and parcel of having modern lives, all of which is good, I believe, but are not dependent on the specific type of modernity that we have in front of us and that we're locked into on an individual level. Like we can't escape it by ourselves. We have to escape it through a state, right? And this is again, circles back to the initial question, like that the problem is not the inevitability of certain patterns of production, consumption, use, and so forth, and its associated degradation. It's that we need to change collectively the types of political and social orders we have.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very good. And it's funny that you say that. You say it's not logistical. The problem is political. I would even go as far as to say that the problem of climate change, for example, is cultural. And if you would engage in a Marxist analysis, I think even Marx would have suggested that our culture is imposed by those in the ruling capitalist class. And that is what guides our idea that we cannot change, or that this kind of lifestyle is what we need. I think you would like my very recent paper. It's called On the Psychology of Capitalism, and I actually followed you on ResearchGate. That's where I have the paper. So I would say follow me back. Then you can then you can read it. But
Yes, yes.
it exactly goes into that idea that the psychology that we have today is actually, in a way, formed in such a way that it reproduces the kind of capitalist system that we are in, and not just that it's also the consumption patterns that we are in, and the idea that this is the way we should live, and almost an impossibility to imagine something outside of that. Um, but then there's still a kind of question that I have as a pessimist in seeing the world that we are in today. When it's political, and I totally agree with you, and it's cultural, I also totally agree with you. But the dominant political and cultural forces at this moment are those that want us to live like this. And if we want to implement all those beautiful changes that you are talking about, we definitely need collaboration as a people. The fractured world that we are in today, I just see no possibility of us engaging in any kind of transformative change with the world that we are. I mean, look around you: Syria, Palestine. I mean, Russia, Ukraine, America, China. How can we get there in an imperialist world? You know what I mean? Like, is there any spark of hope in that sense, Max? Because I think it's exactly this kind of world that we are in, this imperialist, colonialist, capitalist world that stops us from being able to do these kind of transformations.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I absolutely agree with, and I think is one of the harder points to convey in the Northern climate discussion. That if you are only thinking about a transition plan for yourself and not how you are preventing other people from having their own transition plans, then you're creating a walled Eden, right? You're creating a walled garden. You're creating a form of green nationalism no matter what. And of course, it's needless to say that this doesn't mean like solidarity with whatever, cybernetic protest is occurring in the South, right? It actually means seeing how the northern states are preventing people in the South from exercising collective control over their own lives on their own terms, right? Um, Including, of course, and especially the popular classes, right? It's not a question of defending an elite nationalism on its own terms. So, the North is going to carry out some type of ecological transition, whether in the medium term what it will look like, there's a lot of thought about it and a lot of pondering about it. And if it's possible, it will be based on exporting the costs of it to the South, whether that's biofuel plantations, whether that's both reforestation, carbon credits, afforestation, and so forth, right? Basically, a lot of it, if you read the transition plans, a huge portion of it is centered around land use. It's also, of course, centered on mass death, right? Because these models value Southern lives less than they value Northern lives, including the modeling about, the projected damage to GDP per capita and so forth, right? Now, I don't, it's quite impossible to imagine this kind of worldwide just transition, which also I see as a process of worldwide popular developmental convergence that is roughly the same access per capita worldwide to human production, right? Roughly, because like the Arctic needs a different thing than Southern India needs a different thing than Central Europe. But this is not going to happen without national struggles that if they don't succeed, but even more if they do start to succeed, uh, the US and its clients will respond by trying to napalm them out of existence, right? Or drop 52 bunker busters on them if they simply dare to try to exercise political sovereignty over their own armistice lines. I mean, that is what the US is insisting on in Lebanon, that if you exercise political sovereignty, the force that armors that political sovereignty, we will burn it from the face of the earth, right? And that's exactly the same. This is why the US endorsed such a violent reaction to October 7th, right? It's not because the Israel lobby is carrying out some form of domination over US foreign policy. I mean, why would the US, Israel, it's clear, I mean, the threat it faces from armed militia, but there's no reason the the US wants working class or sub-working class, right? Like lumpen proletariat militia to think that they can push back against nuclear armed states to determine their own fate, including to control their own future, to impose things on people who the world agrees, that is, the ruling class agrees, should be more powerful than them. This is why you had to wipe it out. This is why the US and Israel and the EU all agree on completely wiping it out. Because if you can wipe that out, then you can wipe out the Lebanese resistance. Then, of course, you have free reign to impose economic, technological, social arrangements on these countries because you've wiped out even political platforms that are capable of articulating popular interests, including the popular interest in not being subject to war, right? Not even a planning interest, but just the popular interest of saying, okay, you aren't going to be making war on my state. And this is what Iran confronts as well, is the same thing, right? And of course, this is why, as we discussed a bit last time, there's ISIS in 100 kilometers from the border in Algeria. I mean, this idea that they're going to let Algeria stand, not the US and the EU are going to allow Algeria to stand as a strong independent state with many contradictions, of course, that need to be resolved, but that they would let it continue in its current form. I don't see it. It's wildly implausible to me. There's too much oil, there's too much wealth, and it's too close to all the West African states, which of course, the US and its accomplices and its vassals are also contemplating how to deal with at this current moment, right? I think they're focused on other things for now, but I think that they have, they're already letting ISIS run free in those areas, and we'll see what else is to come, right? So this question of national sovereignty, but also national liberation, which are not the same thing, right? National sovereignty is the free and equal participation of states in the international system as sovereign states that will not be subject to basically sanctions and warfare. And national liberation is freeing the control of the productive forces from monopoly capital, including its southern kind of tentacles, that is allowing for popular classes to have control over the productive forces. I mean, this is why Cabral said national liberation is a revolution. He put it very, very clearly. This is what's required, and it's distinguished from a kind of neo-colonial bourgeois outcome to the national question. The U.S. won't allow it, and which means that if one is in the North, one needs to have an orientation to that as well, right? And an orientation to that doesn't mean going online and posting critiques of internal contradictions in Southern nations and the various forces that express partially popular interests. I say partially because, of course, it's partial, right? There couldn't be anything else. And it means stopping the states from doing that. And we see it. I mean, Pal Action and the anti-Maersk campaigns. I mean, these are certain anti-sanctions campaigns that are occurring in the U.S. About Iran and Zimbabwe and elsewhere, and Nodutol, dealing with sanctions on North Korea. I mean, these are real campaigns that are live, and it would be very productive if more people were engaged with them, because in order for it to have developmental convergence, the states of the South and of the North need to carry out policies that would lead to developmental convergence, which means the states of the South need to be able to manage their own affairs, right? I mean, so in terms of this is a very long answer to your question. Sorry. I mean, I think what's happening in Yemen is very important. I mean, is underknown. Every month or two, Yemen, which is not governed by communists, by the way, but it is trying to, and Zimbabwe also, are carrying out policies that are meant to partially delink, to increase the amount of value added domestically. They're doing more transformation domestically, whether that's of lithium, whether that's building steel plants, and whether that's banning the import of flour, which is Yemen recently did, which means they're still importing cereals, but they're going to process it locally, which improves the local productive capacity, adds local technological capacity, improves local value, adds to the amount of local value added. I mean, that's what development is. Development is increasing your productive forces, and also because it's in a capitalist world system, it's increasing your local value share as compared to that of monopoly capital. Right? I mean, it's conflictive, and you have to wrest it from monopoly capital. And that's what Yemen and Zimbabwe are starting to do. And what is the reaction of the US to Yemen and Zimbabwe? I mean, the US killed 500,000 people in Yemen, right? And Zimbabwe has been under economic siege warfare for over 20 years, right? So these are very important. They're not run by communists, in fact. Although there is an ideological influence of Marxist thought in these processes, absolutely, absolutely. And these are things that people could pay more attention to, and in addition to focusing on how their governments are preventing the implementation, let alone the radicalization of the policies these other governments are pondering and themselves trying to implement.
Right, right, right. This is so good because that is what we try to do with this show of ours, this program, is that we try to lay to connect dots, to lay links between things that people usually don't link. So, for example, when we talk about imperialism and colonialism and capitalism, how that relates to our psychology today and the problems that we have and racism and all that stuff. But of course, also when you see what's happening in Palestine or Syria or Yemen, we often do not connect those things to the larger macro battle that is there for for example, a new future, a more independent future, a future also better for the climate, for our world. And that is one of the reasons you just are saying to us, like that's one of the reasons why Yemen is being bombarded into the Stone Age, you could say, because it is also linked to that kind of independence that Yemen is how do you say that? How do I say that in English?
Exhibiting.
Yeah, a kind of independence that it's exhibiting when it comes to how it deals with its own resources and modes of production and that kind of stuff. And that is just so important because people just often just think like, oh, America is bombing Yemen because they are resisting empire and they are a threat to Israel. But there are just so much more and deeper stories where it comes to the whole system that this world is built on, you know. And I think it's so important for us to start connecting these things because otherwise we just keep fighting the symptoms and not the real problem. And you said something very to me personally very important and triggering, and that is a fear that I've also had for many years, a lingering subconscious fear that I actually never discussed with people, but you just mentioned it. I was like, yeah, that's a fear that I had. This idea that how such a huge country like Algeria is getting away still with not being one of those one of the few or one of the multiple countries that is being bombed into the Stone Age and having slave markets right now, such as Libya. I mean, I've always thought, when is the turn of Algeria coming with this wealth of gas and a huge chunk of the Sahara? I think maybe even the biggest part of the Sahara is in Algeria. I mean, the Algerians can be so incredibly rich, and the yeah, you were just saying like, oh, they're just what is it, 100 kilometers from the border, ISIS, and that it really touched on a fear that I had, like when's the turn of Algeria coming? When's the turn of Algeria coming? You know what I mean? How come they're still unscathed? Can you expand on that a little bit more, Max?
No, I don't know. But they go for either softer targets or more urgent targets, basically. I mean, I think those are the two targeting procedures carried out by the US. Now, Algeria has been decent in the field of in the international fora with respect to Palestine, but Algeria is not doing what Iran is doing or what Yemen is doing um, with respect to Palestine. I mean, Algeria also has a very substantial um, trade relationship with the EU and also is a major source of strategic commodities for the EU. So it's Algeria presents problems. It's I don't think the state policies, even like lots of investments in education, for example. I mean, these are not something particularly liked by the US in the longer term. It doesn't want any form of even remotely emergent or remotely autonomous poles of accumulation, right? But I think Algeria is a tough target. I mean, there's a huge. I'm not like as versed in Algeria as I should be, but like my understanding is that there's a huge popular support for the army and for the state. Not, of course, not necessarily for le pouvoir, right? That's a different thing. But the Algerian popular movement has been very supportive of the former two, of the state and the army, and this creates major difficulties for a U.S. operation, right? I mean, the U.S. Look at how the U.S. The U.S. is threatening Iran, but the U.S. really wants to induce a full separation between not just the people and the so-called regime in Iran, but also the state itself, right? And they want to delegitimize this form of rule. And you see it even in the scholarship about Iran. I mean, a week ago, I was reading a paper um, basically stating that the Kurdish, basically periodizing the Kurdish contradiction, the Kurdish question in Iran from 1979. That's when, according to this paper, the Kurdish question started to emerge, right? Uh, and there was a lot about like internal colonialism and so forth. I mean, the specifics don't actually have to detain us, but what's being agitated there at the ideological level is actually a counter-revolution against 1979 itself, right? And this is the same thing that's being agitated for by people trying to use Iran's internal gender contradictions in the US to say that Iran is the same actually as Israel, right? This is a very frequent comparison by comprador mercenary intellectuals in the West who are writing on Iran. And so, there's an attempt to induce this total cleavage between people and state, and not just the specific government, but also the specific government. And this does not seem to me very successful at all in Algeria. I think this is in the back of people's minds for sure, but I don't see that. I don't see the attempts at ethnic fracturing in Algeria have been very unsuccessful to my knowledge. The attempts to use the question of the question of Amazigh or Berber as a cleavage to shatter cohesion, including national identity in Algeria, has been very, very unsuccessful and actually seems to be actively repudiated. Um, so you have these dynamics that make Algeria a hard target. And so the US is focusing on either softer targets or more urgent targets that are actively supporting the uh, the guerrilla operations in ways that the Algerian government has not.
Hmm. I wanted to uh suggest something that might be a more positive or optimistic vision, although I'm nervous even saying it. Because certainly if I were on an alien civilized planet and I was going to bet on the future direction of Homo sapiens, I would be betting against it. But I'm not. I'm here on this planet. So in terms of optimism, I would just say when I was in my 20s, first getting politicized, learning about the world, etc., there were two schools of thought about China at the time. And that was one, very pessimistic. Look, China has taken the capitalist road. It's game over. They're going to be the workshop of the world forever. There's going to be a local capitalist class that takes over control of the government, and they're going to be perfectly happy with staying in a subordinate position in US dominated global capitalism. So there's no hope there. And the other side of it was, well, don't be so sure. I mean, that certainly there's plenty of evidence for that in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, but we can't completely count out the possibility that they're not going to head in that direction and that they're going to use smart state intervention to try to build up their productive capacity, master the various parts of high technology that are necessary for latest military uses, all sorts of things to run a modern economy. That they're going to focus on that, and once they achieve that level of independence, where they no longer have the threat of being cut off from inputs that they can't produce themselves, then they might do something very different entirely. So I kind of took the latter side back in the 2000s, but of course there was no definitive proof at that time. Now, 20 years later, I would say that side of the debate looks like very much like it won. The direction China is going in is more in line with that latter side of the debate. And I bring that up just to say that if there's any state in the world that's getting close to the kind of intervention we would want to see to create or have the possibility of a just transition, it would have to be China. There's no other country that has invested anywhere near as much in the renewable technologies that we're going to rely on in the future. So I would just say, although I'm not going to give a full blueprint because that would be impossible. It's a complex system, no way to predict it accurately. There are some hopeful signs there that uh, if China continues in this same direction, I'll grant to the pessimists that the U.S. and Europe right now look very grim, but I would just remind them that the Planck principle exists. Political progress can happen one funeral at a time, and as we have older generations dying off, and the ideas that define their lives dying with them, and younger generations taking over, there's a very vague but nonetheless undeniably hopeful, I think, future trajectory that we can imagine. And I hope that that gives people some succor, the opposite of enervation. It gives them some energy to continue their work of educating, organizing, etc. So I just wanted to throw that in there as the token optimist. Do you have or Max, do you have a different vision of an optimistic future? Because there's so many different possibilities. This is just one very vague possibility.
No, no, I think that if things work out okay or begin to move in a positive direction, China has a part to play, absolutely, in terms of especially technology sharing. I mean, with everything else, the most threatening achievement, the central battleground, it seems, between the US and China is over technological sovereignty, right? As we saw with Huawei and as we see with semiconductors, that in almost every field of, first of all, in almost every field of technological innovation, the Chinese have essentially achieved sovereignty. I think airplanes is the remaining high-tech field that China hasn't achieved sovereignty. The question is, on what terms will this be shared with the rest of the world, right? And as I see it, this will be shared with the rest of the world on whatever terms the rest of the world is enforced through its states, right? China rides on the back on of a world system of unequal exchange. It's clear, and it's very unproductive to deny it. And actually, this is different from Soviet trade, right? Which was not always doing that, even with Eastern Europe, let alone Cuba, right? That there were different systems of trade in place. China's not doing that. It could have an internal shift that would push it to do it. I'm not aware of those conversations, but absent that, China doesn't have a lot of what it needs for its continued industrial prosperity. Therefore, it has to get things from elsewhere. Therefore, technology sharing could be part of a struggle over terms of trade, including value added and so forth. That is, other countries kind of doing some of what China did in terms of its own process of technological indigenization over the course of its economic development process since 1949, right? So I think this is the optimistic scenario that's possible. There isn't good analysis that I've seen, for example, over how much this is happening in the Zimbabwe steel production, for example. Are there arrangements for actually not technology transfer, because this is too late in with neo-colonial terms, but actually knowledge transfer? Actually, the classic critique that from the Arab region was always that what was transferred during the so-called technology transfer was technical transfer. That is, implements were transferred, whereas technology, understood as the overall system of knowledge and production, design, and so forth, was not transferred. Technology remained in the north. Techniques and metals were transferred to the south. And so the question is whether the third world nations, which with which China is bound in terms of its developmental trajectory. China is not autarky and China is not an island, can have popular sovereign governments that will have new trading compacts with China. Now, in this sense, I think any person can agree that one, China's not going to do it of its own accord, right? It doesn't see things that way. Um, Two, China does not have a tendency to violently rip countries back into its preferred terms of trade, right? And its preferred trading architecture. That's what the US does. That's what the EU does. That's not what China does. So this opens the space for internal struggles to then within countries to contest their trading relationships with a China that wants to trade with them. And this is the optimistic outcome of what we can hope to see in the short, medium, and long term in terms of a worldwide just transition. And the fact that China has developed, actually, Tunisia, for example, is doing some semi-sovereign solar implantation. I don't know if China is involved in that, to be honest. Some of it for sure, but I'm not really sure the dynamics of that right now. But this is the technology for renewable energy has to be shared. Otherwise, and you can be sure that people in the Chinese leadership are aware of it, and they're going to go down with the rest of the ship, right? Um, Americans are just very sure that their ship is made of steel and they can float on whatever comes, right? That's the outlook of the U.S. leadership.
Yeah. For now, until the Planck principle does its work.
God willing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess we already took a lot of your time, Max.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
No,
Thanks
thank
a
you.
lot.
Thank you,
Yeah.
guys.
And I hope this is not the last time because I think we can have a lot of interesting conversations with you. So I hope you allow us to bother you again in the future, Max.
Yes, let's give your listeners a chance to be on board with my voice and talking points, and then we can circle back.
Actually, speaking of our listeners, could you just give them the name of the book that you were describing earlier, the book you wrote about the just transition?
That's a book, A People's Green New Deal, and you can find it open access.
Great, great.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah.
once again. It was a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate it and looking forward to the next time.
Great. Thanks to you guys.
All right. See
Have a
you.
good one.
Okay. All
Peace.
right.
Bye.
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 Yeah, great.
Yeah, I hope that the people out there who are just decimated and pessimistic and just fatalistic can look into this stuff because I mean I don't know if that'll solve it because the political impediment is nothing to shake a stick at, but it's a hell of a lot better when your only impediment is political rather than it being technical. You can't break the laws of physics. There are no laws of politics. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that's why I wrote the book to give people, some kind of thing that they can think about.
yeah, I'm gonna have to check it out myself.
Yeah. There's just, we're up against such a powerful force, man. These monsters that are running the world right now. Man,
Oh,
yeah, I
it's
feel
crazy.
hopeless
I mean, they're
sometimes.
trying to put the final solution right now in Gaza. I'm sure of it.
Yep. Yep, exactly. And they really, really don't care, man. If it's up to them, they wipe out the whole Arab population. Seriously, they don't give a damn at all, man.
Yeah, the dot I
No,
connect that, people say the president of Gaza is going to be the future of the world, but practically speaking, the complete ripping up international law, the idea of proportionality, all of that stuff ripped to shreds. That's not what we want when we're facing a world of very likely many more wars over resources, mass migration, etc. Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't really need to say anything more.
Yeah, yeah, no, the situation
Harrowing.
is
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, it's crazy, like the recent time they're really trying to impose a new paradigm right now, and I'm worried if there is not a bigger crack in Israel amongst the support. I mean, actually, Netanyahu's not popular, but he's exercising power. And if there isn't a crack there, a crack in Turkey, a crack in Egypt, um, or Jordan, or Iran or Yemen does something spectacular, then I think there's a real danger at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I agree. I think that I'm very afraid that there will be a day that we talk about the Palestinian people in past tense. You know, I mean, there are so many civilizations and groups of people that once existed and were almost wiped out, and I see it happening now as well, and it's a very yeah very scary.
I mean, yeah, this I'm a bit more optimistic about, just because I think this is the danger of why they're have not pushed so hard on ethnic cleansing, is that any Palestinian population is going from whatever state they're in from Gaza is going to go to war with Israel.
Yeah,
Like that's why the Egyptians don't want them, the Jordanians don't want them, wherever they are. Uh, the young people are, may heal for a little bit, and then they're just going to,
that's why they try
yeah,
to kill them instead of moving them out.
yeah,
You know,
Yeah.
it reminds me of what this guy in the cradle said. His name is Karim also, and I remember him saying like he's so you can see it on his face. He's so disappointed with the way many people in the Arab world, such as in his own country, Lebanon, are dealing with what's happening. He said all they do is fighting each other, fighting the symptoms, and he said that. He said, what use does it have to just keep fighting HTS and all these groups? He said, if you really want to deal with the problem, you should start fighting the people like the Saud al Saud family. He said, these are the people we should start targeting over here instead of only fighting the stupid symptoms the whole time. And
Yeah.
he was so frustrated with the Arab resistance and people who are fighting back. He said, this is in Dutch we say this is like mopping with the water tap open. You know, this is just like always fighting the symptoms endlessly. He's like, why are they not just going for the big guys? Why are they not attacking the Al Saud family? Why are they not attacking Netanyahu? What is going on here? He didn't get it, and I'm like, yeah, he has a very good point there.
A friend of mine was complaining about this over vacation. He talked to a bunch of his family, friends, huge family, and he first lays out how the Saudi government is massively supportive of the Israeli government, and he asked them all, you're against the genocide in Gaza. Like, of course, they're all the Muslim side of his family. And so he's like, okay, well, here's the way that the Saudi government is essential for the Israeli regime. So why don't you, for instance, boycott Hajj? And they're all like, oh no, that we can't do. And it just shows like beliefs, thought patterns, etc. They're so fucking hard to change, even when you can get someone to agree on point, and then the next step requires a revision of their thinking, and then oh no.
guys, I gotta run. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
have someone here just came in.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Great talking with you.
Okay, great talking to you. Bye.
All right. Bye
Bye.
bye.